Pilipinas ay napapagitnaan ng dalawang katubigan, dalawang karagatan. Pagka yung mapa natin sa itaas ng ganyan, dito sa kaliwa, titingnan natin, nakaharap po tayo, ay yung West Philippine Sea. Doon naman sa kanan, yun pong Pacific Ocean. Nagpapalag po yan doon sa tuktok. Doon sa may ituktok natin, doon sa may Taiwan na. Di ba? Ano ba ang pinakadulo nating Babuyan Island ba yun? O Bataan? Anyway, Taiwan Strait o Luzon Strait, doon yung nagpapalag po. Kailangan tayo ng makakuha po tayo ng pahayag sa mga nag-aaral dyan at may mga malalalim na pag-aaral at mga research. Nasa linya po si Dr. Melissa Loja. Dr. Melissa, salamat po sa pagtanggap sa tawag. Unang-una ho, kumusta ho ang ating mga katubigan, Dr. Melissa?
Yung sa South China Sea and the Pacific as well as the Taiwan Straits, masyado talagang mataas ang tension.
Pagka sinabi po ninyong tension, anong yung ibig kong sabihin dito, Dr. Melissa?
Yes, there is a competition for deniability of access. Ang ibig sabihin, if you're a maritime power, your intention, your interest is to deny another maritime power or an upcoming maritime power access to your area of control. And in this instance, the United States has maintained its predominance in the Pacific. It considers the Pacific as a Pacific lake, as its own lake. And therefore, its intention or its interest is to deny China the power to navigate freely in the Pacific. At the same time, the United States needs to control China and limit its access to navigation in the South China Sea. And therefore, the importance of the South China Sea in what is known in international relations as the island chain of the U.S.
Parang sinasabi ninyo dito, Dr. Melissa, sa pagkakaintindi ko, may isang bahagi na gustong pumasok, yung isa namang pwersa, pinipigil.
Yes. Yun yung narrative of the West, that they see China as a threat to their dominance in the Pacific. Ang narrative naman po ng China is that they are seeking access to waters for commercial purposes, and that they are not trying to assert military dominance in the Pacific, which is why their focus is on the Belt and Road Initiative, consisting of more on economic packages rather than military installations and bases. So yun yung narrative ng China. So there is a clash not just of military might or military assertion, but even as to narratives.
Dr. Melissa, sa kaliwa natin yung West Philippine Sea, sa kanan ng bahagi natin yung western part, yung Pacific Ocean, na kapwa merong mga tinatawag na military activities. Nasa gitna ang Pilipinas. Doon sa tuktok ang Taiwan. Ibig pong sabihin, yung ito ba yung sinasabing parang senaryo na kung bakit yung mga bansang nakapaligid dyan, kung hindi man ang kanilang depensa ay pang-opensa, ay para palakasin yung kanilang mga sariling depensa in case meron sabi nga yung tension na yan tumaas pa o humantong pa doon sa level ng wag naman yung confrontation.
Right. For the Pacific Island countries as well as the Philippines, of course, we have an interest to beef up our security and to make sure that we can deter any external attacks. But the more important for me, the more important role of any government of these countries would be to maintain the neutrality of their states. This is because no matter the amount of armaments that will be stockpiled in the Philippines by one party to any conflict, eventual conflict between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, or the US, we will just be the cannon fodder we will just be the foot soldiers. Hindi tayo yung made-destroy rather than the US. Kasi malayo naman ang Amerika. Malayo din ang China from America. And we will just be turned into ashes, similar to what's going on in Ukraine. So even as we need to, of course, ensure our security, we also need to preserve our neutrality. And that's the only, actually, that's the most important step towards ensuring our survival and security. So the thinking is dapat we shed off our neutrality to ensure our security. That's not the case. And the best example would be Ukraine. Ukraine shed off its neutrality in the conflict between the US, NATO, and Russia, and now it is being devastated. So for the Philippines, we should look at the situation or any developments in the South China Sea and the Pacific in the wider context of the global, the great power context between China and the US. We should always look at it in that context rather than be parochial and naive and think that this conflict is just between the US trying to help the Philippines versus China. That's not the case. We are a tool or possibly a pawn in this contest between the US and China. And as such, we have to be very self-conscious of that possibility, and therefore protect ourselves rather than try to shed off our neutrality.
Dr. Melissa, ang Pilipinas ay miyembro ng ASEAN at ang ASEAN may isang siyang nandun siya sa tinatawag na neutrality status o zone of peace,
yes,
of freedom and neutrality. Pero yung mga member countries, meron din silang tinatawag na pag-beef up ng kanilang defense. Sa Pilipinas, meron tayong tinatawag na, of course, meron tayong BFA, mga Mutual Defense Treaty na ganyan. Ito ba ay nakakatulong para ma-maintain natin yung pagiging, o ma-maintain natin yung membership natin sa ASEAN ng zone of peace and neutrality, at the same time palalakasin natin yung ating defense internally and externally?
Well, it would depend. The statement of the Prime Minister of Malaysia, Anwar, earlier, he said that what the Philippines is going through with the US might endanger the neutrality of the ASEAN region. What he meant by that is that the Edca has a provision which allows the US to stockpile weapons. And once that happens, and US becomes a belligerent party with vis-a-vis China, Iran, North Korea, or Russia, then the Philippines ceases to be treated as a neutral state and can be targeted either in a preemptive attack or a defensive attack or a counter-offensive attack. And once it happens, ASEAN as a region ceases to be a neutral region, because then the other ASEAN states would have to take a position on whether to condemn the attack or to maintain neutrality in that event. So yun po yung worry ni Premier Anwar, and that is something that the Philippines needs to consider, kasi hindi pwedeng magkawatak-watak ang ASEAN. And the important thing to consider as well is that if you look at our neighbors, Vietnam, for instance, has been a very strong ally of the United States, but it never allows the United States to stockpile weapons in Vietnam. Singapore as well, they have visitation forces in Singapore, but Singapore does not allow the United States to willy-nilly stockpile weapons in Singapore. They have complete control, sovereign control of whatever foreign power would stockpile weapons or have access to weapons in their own territory. But that is no longer guaranteed by Edca. I'm sure that there are questions raised among your audience, but what about the Supreme Court decision on Edca? Yes, the Supreme Court upheld the constitutionality of Edca, Well, we have to remember that Edca was agreed in 2014 at the time when there was no arms race. Right now, there is an arms race, and it's heating up. By this, I mean that in 2019, the United States withdrew from the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty. And lately, Russia also withdrew from that treaty. Under the treaty, the two superpowers agreed not to stockpile not just nuclear, but also conventional, meaning non-nuclear missiles with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers. So right now, they are stockpiling those missiles. And based on the 2022 RAND report, which was issued by, RAND report is a think tank which is funded by the US government. Ang sabi dun sa report was that the only way for the US to balance the military power of China and Russia is for the US to find a host in the Indo-Pacific area where they can stockpile their yun nga yung 500 to 5,500 missiles, yung trajectory. And that is now the danger that we find ourselves in, because EDCA does not have a provision which allows the Philippine government to inspect the kind of weapons that will be stockpiled.
Yun nga sanang itatanong ko, na may posibilidad na meron niyang mga weapons na binabanggit niyo yan,
Yes,
yan sa mga EDCA sites
yes,
na
po.
yan.
Even if sabihin ng government na, oh, we are already inspecting, but that's not in the text of the agreement. And therefore, at any given moment, the US can just say, wait a minute, there is nothing in the provision which gives you the authority to inspect the weapons that we're bringing in. Now, if we have to compare the EDCA text with the text of the EDCA with Australia, with Poland and Bulgaria, and I mean US, Bulgaria, US, Poland, US, Australia EDCAs. In their EDCAs, very express po yung provision which says that before the US can introduce a weapon into the territory, the government, the host government, needs to know the type, not just the quantity, but the very specific type, and must have the right to either object or consent to the introduction of that weapon. That is not found in the current EDCA. And of course, even if there's already a upholding of constitutionality of the agreement, iba na yung situation ngayon dahil may arms race na. And the arms race is not just nuclear. Cyber war na siya. Cyber weapons na siya. Unmanned vehicles na siya. Even yun nga yung sinabi na conventional weapons with such a long range na pwedeng makonsider na devastating enough to justify a preemptive strike on the Philippines.
At yan sa sinasabi po yung mga sinasite yung mga instances na yan, o mga factors na yan, kaya masasabi pong tensionado ang West Philippine Sea, ang Western Pacific, yung mga tinatawag niya. Kahit nga sinasabi nga yung competition din ng China dyan sa China at ng Amerika, dyan sa may bahagi po ng Pacific Islands, ay mukhang mataas din, Dr. Melissa.
Yes, and we need to be aware that the very arguments that I'm raising against the EDCA provision on lack of consent on the part of the government to any type of weapon being introduced by the US, the very same arguments are being raised by the US against Chinese security cooperation agreements in the Pacific Island countries. So it's a type of projection where you were saying that China here is violating the sovereignty of the Pacific Island countries by introducing an agreement which would endanger the neutrality of those Pacific Island countries. But the very same criticism would apply to the Philippines.
Mainit na mainit ang usapin ng EDCA, lalo na itong pagbisita dito ni isang mataas na opisyal ng State Department na si Victoria Nuland, at may mga ibang mga lathalay na artikulong sinulat sa kanya na sinasabing siya ay architect of something. Ano ang masasabi niyo dito, Dr. Melissa, yung pagbisitang yan Undersecretary Victoria Nuland.
Opo. Yes, I'm aware yung mga intrigues against Undersecretary Newland, but I would focus on her statement na yung pagpunta niya dito is to demonstrate to the Filipinos that the US alone would be able to bring development, energy security, climate change security, etc. to the Philippines. But my point is, I would say thank you if that would be the purpose of the US, but why should we exclude other partners in terms of development, in terms of investment? Why should we just put all our eggs in one basket, in the US basket? Why should not we cultivate relations, economic relations, trade relations with China, with Japan, with Australia, with Russia, etc.? Because the main point here is that whatever is in our interest should be pursued. Our interest should not depend on what should be the interest of the United States, because there is no school of global development or economic development which would tell us that development would depend on only one partnership. It has always been global, and it has always been multipolar.
Dr. Melissa Loja, thank you so much ma'am for your time, at kahit papano ay napagbigay po tayo ng ibang punto de vista sa ating mga kababayan, lalong-lalo dito sa everyday may narinig tayong balita tungkol sa West Philippine Sea, na paligiran yung ating mga barko o hinamon ng ating Philippine Coast Guard, at kahit paano ay naibigyan natin ng ibang pananaw ang ating mga kababayan.